morning, sir. I am having a hard time nga mag-convert to PDF ani nga file. That's why I'm just going to report it by koan kanang inani lang. So, I will be tackling the contemporary power system. The previous chapters of Part 5 have analyzed the balance of power process to the breakout of World War II, so only in considering the impact of collective security that we have ventured into the more contemporary age. So in this chapter, we shall incorporate the insights of both sets of analysis to examine the contemporary power system as a whole, so looking at the interaction of the patterns of power and the resulting power process in the nuclear age. So there is much difference of opinion over the meaning of this event and even greater difference over their causes and effects. So to understand the present period, we must first see how the stage was set by World War II and its immediate aftermath. So first we have here the tenuous cooperation, World War II. So once again, war broke out over the disputes of nationality in Eastern Central Europe, so sparked in part by the German quest for continental conquest, and once again extended to a world confrontation, the combat zones of which touch the oceans or the heartlands of almost every continent. So that Hitler initially exploited his opportunities extremely well is beyond doubt. Why his ultimate enemies failed at first to join effectively together is more complicated. So, both nations, um, both nations, who were subsequently to be known as superpowers, made no effective response to Nazi Germany as late as 1939. So, thus, both nations were subsequently to be known as superpowers of no effective response to Nazi Germany as late as 1939, although Stalin evidently thought he was playing the game shrewdly. In the United States, the top leadership had at least begun to suspect the futility of the course that was being taken. So, it was Hitler also who took the lead in ending this disarray. In June 1941, he broke his arrangement with the Soviet Union and attacked in his Operation Barbarossa. So, then in December 1941, when Japan attacked the U.S., Germany chose to initiate a declaration of war, thus making America willy-nilly Russia's ally. In one sense, therefore, the coalition of the United Kingdom, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States was a shotgun marriage. So, they were brought together and kept together as long as Hitler remained dangerous, by the overriding need to cooperate against the axis of Hitler Germany and fascist Italy. So, simultaneously, two of these allies, but not the Soviet Union, aided China and fought Japan in the Pacific. So, at the Moscow Conference of so long as victory was in doubt, the agreement was more extensive as in 1941. So at the Moscow Conference of October 1941, at the foreign minister level, the powers agreed to the principle of no separate peace, promised punishment for German atrocities, massacres, and executions, pledged to the Allies to continue the present close collaboration after the war. So, promised to set up a free and independent Austria and decided to create a new international organization to which they would belong. At the Cairo Conference on December 1, 1943, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek agreed to strip Japan of its conquered territories. So, territories, and to return certain of these, including Formosa, Taiwan, to China. They also endorsed a free and independent Korea. So, in the controversial Yalta Conference on February 1945, Roosevelt Churchill and Stalin met again and agreed to establish a democratic Poland, so which would receive substantial accessions of territory in the north and west. So, um, the status quo was to be maintained in Outer Mongolia, Russia, and reacquire southern Sakhalin. Port Arthur would be leased to the Soviets as a naval base, and the southern Mongolian and Chinese Eastern railroads would be jointly operated by Russia and the nationalist government of China. So the Potsdam Conference of July to August 1945 was the final wartime gathering. So here, Churchill replaced by Attlee after the British election. Truman and Stalin decided to establish a Council of Foreign Ministers representing the United Kingdom, the USSR, Nationalist China, France, and the United States. So the council, which was to be composed of high-ranking deputies in the absence of the foreign ministers, was to draw up peace treaties for Italy and the smaller European satellite countries. So on Poland, the conference agreed the final delimitation of the western frontier of Poland shall await the peace settlement. So, but that in the meantime, Poland would administer German, East Prussia, Silesia, and extensive parts of Brandenburg and Pomerania. Finally, the Balkan states and Italy, following the conclusion of peace treaties, were to be jointly supported by the membership in the UN. And then we have the uneasy peace, Cold War. So the purely how few of the long range goals were ever implemented. So what is impressive about these conferences from the perspective of today is how few of the long range goals were ever implemented. So the purely military obligations were honored promptly, for all had a common interest in achieving victory. But the temporary political arrangements tended to become more and more permanent as relations grew stiffer between Russia and the West. So the temporary division of Germany pending the formation of all the German government still persisted 4 decades later, just as did the temporary division of Korea and parallel. Not until 1955 did these states achieve their promised membership in UN. So the proposed permanent disposition for the free and independent Austria took until mid-1955 to realize. So these pieces of unfinished business were indications of the growing disharmony among the Allied great powers in the immediate post-war period. So the discord grew out of the obvious fact that only the U.S. stood in the way of, after 1945, of Russia's exciting unchecked power over prostate Europe. So the great difference in outlook and philosophy between the two superpowers had been deliberately soft-pedaled by common consent during the war. So there have been clashes, but the main issues have been kept limited and permissible. So both sides were agreed that Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria should be democratic, but by the term they meant very different things. So the United States' insistence on really free elections would almost certainly, if honored, have created anti-communist states once more on Russia's doorstep. So the United States principle that each people should freely decide its own future, in this case, devoted neatly with the idea of containing Russia in Eastern Europe. So on March 12, 1947, when the announcement of the Truman Doctrine, the President, a corollary to the moral principle of self-determination of the peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced upon them against their will. So the government of the U.S. has made frequent protests over Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. So this is more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed on free peoples by directed indirect aggression undermine the foundation of international peace and hence the security of the United States. So this statement must be considered one of the most far-reaching principles um, ever to be announced by the major power as guide to the conduct of foreign policy. So British had decided on February 24 to withdraw their forces from Greece in order to economize their slender resources. Um, without aid, they said, without outside aid, the process of recovery in many countries would take long as to give rise to hopelessness and hopelessness and despair. On June 5, Secretary of State George C. Marshall followed up this theme. It would be neither fitting nor efficacious for this government to undertake to withdraw unilaterally a program designed to place Europe on its feet economically. And on um, economically. But on July 12, 16 European states, all of non-communist Europe but Spain, together with Iceland and Turkey. So in February 1948, Czechoslovakia, which had sought to be a bridge between East and West, fell on eternal communist scope. So without outside aid, without outside aid, the process of recovery in many countries would take long as to give rise to hopelessness and despair. Hopelessness and despair. No. In the Mutual Defense Assistance Act of 1949, $1 billion was authorized by military aid. So Asia now replaced Europe as the main theater of the Cold War. The fall of the nationalist Chinese regime from power on the mainland in 1949 increased tensions appreciably with major effects on internal United States policy, as we shall see in the next chapter. So in the summer of 1965, the failure of the relatively minor effort by U.S. observers and training detachment in South Vietnam to halt communist Viet Cong successes led to decision by the U.S. to send active combat forces to the area. So yeah, then in 1968, the Soviets put an end to Czechoslovakian liberal development by invasion and occupation. Um, so each superpower's actions helped to renew Cold War tensions, but those tensions were already occurring in a world where many other things had changed. So now we have here perspectives from bipolarity to polycentrism. So while the superpowers were preoccupied, the world around them was changing. So in the first decade of the World War II, at the height of the Cold War, when it became highly popular to speak of the age of superpowers, two nations appeared above all others to have world control within their grasp. If they chose to use their power, and especially if they did not frustrate each other's efforts through mutual opposition, who could say them no? Yes, the very expectation that the U.S. and the Soviet Union would collaborate, a view that had much to do with how the Charter of the United Nations was shaped. So flew in the face of past experience. So much more likely was a competition for power and positions such as actually took place. So the United States had the bomb in 1945, but the Soviet Union did not explode an atomic device until 1949. So, on the other hand, the United States the United States demobilized its conventional force to a quite low level, but the Soviets kept very large forces under arms. So, um, yeah, and then um, so Soviets, even if they continued to maintain large armed forces, came to appear as such a threat. So why? So why the Soviets, even if they continued to maintain large armed forces, came as threats? So first, the answer actually is threefold. So first, two of the Soviet Union's most important and traditional enemies, Germany and Japan, had been defeated and occupied as a result of war. So the relative gain in Soviet influence and power was consequently enormous simply because of the temporary removal of customary restraints. So moreover, other significant pre-war powers were temporarily eclipsed. So second, the territorial positions of the Soviets was revolutionized by World War II. Not only were the losses of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905 and of World War I substantially regained, but the Soviet Union was now occupied most of Eastern Europe as well as significant areas of Central Europe. So third, the evangelical nature of communism and the large communist party that emerged in France and Italy after the war seemed to promise even further gains for the Soviets. So, with the Greece engaged in a bitter civil war against the communists in 1947, with the Czechoslovakia, the victim of the internal communist in February 1948, and especially with the blockade of Berlin in a reality between June 1948 and May 1949, the promise became an active threat. So we are less certain that the Soviet Union intended to precipitate a power struggle over Germany in quite the way it developed. So as the Cold War continued, formerly colonial nations became independent and in the older centers of power, such as Germany and Japan. Um, Japan, significant national strength once again appeared. So the period of superpower predominance began to come to an end once these developments were well underway, certainly by the end of the 1950s. So, um, that period of predominance did not end because the United States and Soviet Union declined its absolute power. So quite the contrary, in the 1950s, both superpowers developed military forces that were more formidable than any of the world has previously seen. So not only did both the U.S. and the Soviet Union maintained enormous conventional capability, but both began to develop the nuclear capability, each of which was far more extensive than the controlled by any third state of a group of states. What ended the predominance was the re-establishment of third centers of powers, the reluctance and the unwillingness of those third centers of power to play the roles of pawns in the superpower competition, and the closeness and scale of the superpower nuclear race. So that's it. So, American strengths and weaknesses. The United States view the strategic problem confronting its foreign policy in the post-1945 period had both its strengths and its weaknesses. So, we have here, first, the U.S. tended to deal with communist states, although all communist nations collectively constituted the primary American enemy. Mm. Um, It's essentially strength lay in the unprecedented commitment of the United States to creation and maintenance of a stable balance of power in all major areas of the world. So yeah, um, so that in this way, in the first weakness of the U.S. This way, the United States voluntarily denied itself the hope of isolating its important enemy. So, second, here we have U.S. did little exploit counterbalancing national interests among its enemies or take account of them in dealing with and in dealing its friends. So, in this way, the United States failed to deal wisely with China or with France. So, third, the United States' effort helped to produce the most tense form of the balance of power. So, rigid bipolarity and ran a greater risk of inducting war than was necessary. So fourth, we have U.S. put great resources into a struggle in Southeast Asia that was at best of marginal utility to its interests and at worst counterproductive. So in this way, especially because of the emotional and at worst counterproductive, uh, uh yeah, um, emotional and backlash at home and a negative attitude and it's produced toward the United backlash um, at home and a negative attitude, states defense budget, the United States found itself weaker in the several years of the 1970s that was prudent in the view of of Soviet activities. Situ- uh, so so that is it. Thank you. Merry Christmas.